Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining today. The title of today's webinar is Maintenance for Your Security Review Tables, Keeping a Tidy Environment. Our presenter today is Preston Leftwich, who will introduce himself in just a moment. But first, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. My name is Stephanie Anderson, and I'm the Global Webinar Manager here at Pathlock. If you can't hear this audio, click on Preferences and then Audio. From there, you can check to see if you're using the appropriate audio device. You can also click on the play button to check if you can hear the sound coming from your speakers. There will be a Q&A session following the presentation, so please type any questions into the Q&A chat box for Preston to answer at the end of the event. To prevent background noise, everyone is on mute. And with that, I'll turn the time over to Preston.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. So it's another quick webinar today. I know we've got it on the books for an hour, but really this should only take about a half an hour to kind of chat about how to keep things neat and tidy and maybe why you want to do that. For those of you I have not met before virtually, obviously not too many of you I've met in person, my name is Preston Leftwich. I am a technical manager here at Pathlock, and I work specifically in sort of application conversations, how the product works, architecture questions, and that, so forth and so on. So as you work through things, if you do have questions and you think of scenarios that you're coming up with or working through, I'm happy to talk about them now, or certainly can talk about them offline if you'd like to. Certainly email me anything and I'll be happy to help you. Thank you for coming. I know everybody has a busy day. So with that, we'll get kind of on with the topics. So table maintenance, you know, in JD Edwards, and after having done this for 20 years, table maintenance can be kind of a tricky subject, right? A lot of us have conversations about the size of the 911 and the size of the 4211 and tables that just grow exponentially depending on volume. And what happens is when you implement audit software, there are lots of tables that can get out of control if you don't kind of have a plan in place. And specifically with that, the idea is we want to talk about, you know, what tables do we want to even have a maintenance kind of plan in place for, and why we maintain those tables, and then what can we do internally? What have we got in our product repertoire on to kind of keep that maintenance not a heavy lift for you as a company, and then what happens if you don't really actually maintain the table. So the idea is, for those of you that are familiar with things like 21 CFR 11, where you can turn on audit tracking and you track every single activity in the system, that'll actually bury your performance. And so none of us actually do that. What we do is we do maintenance on things like setup tables, right? Bank accounts and vendor tables, paychecks, that kind of stuff, whereby we're looking for preemptive audit and data that might get changed, and that keeps our transactions down as well. Same idea from the actual internal table structure, though. Some of the configuration tables, some of the audit tables, some of the security tables that we have, if you're in the middle of a project, if you're in the middle of looking at particular sets of data and those start to grow very quickly, you'd want to have a plan in place to kind of take care of those. And so broke them into kind of three categories to talk about today. The first one being audit tables, right? So if you run and have the audit manager tool installed inside of JD Edwards, one of the things that you do is run a periodic audit. Now, some people run that audit very heavy at the beginning as they're trying to work through SOD and look for problems in the system. So they'll run them every day, every couple of days as they make changes to kind of account for problems in the application as far as their structures are concerned with roles and responsibilities. But on the second part of that conversation, once you get into an iterative routine, whether you do it monthly, biweekly, quarterly, whatever, there's still lots of data out there, right? There's still potentially numerous amounts of volume that have been out there from previous designs, previous iterations. And so what we want to do is talk about how we're going to maintain those tables and what you can do from a strategy there. From the SMP, from the Security Manager Pro side of things, same idea. As you're bringing in data from JD Edwards, as you're working in security, one of the things we have you do is turn off straight access to the 950 as a best practice, and we start to audit all of the security activities in the system so that you have access to who's changed security, when was it granted, that kind of thing. Well, that level of detail can create a volume of records in the system. And then also, as you use that import tool in Security Manager Pro to bring in existing records from acquisitions or new security role projects that you kick off, all of those records get brought into entities, and then there's multiple roles and rows of data that go into those that data set. And as they get worked with, sometimes as you decommission roles or users and so forth, that data is stale, it's no longer relevant. So we want to talk about maintaining that as well. And then on the periodic review side, well, one of the things that you do with periodic review is, right, you're creating two different types of reviews. One is the role itself, whether it's relevant and active in your system and how it's being utilized, and then that's appropriate. Two, you're coming back and looking at the users attached to those roles and if that's relevant and active. So your numbers can grow quite massively every time you run a periodic review. Now, a lot of us run it once every 6 months, sometimes it's once a year, but still, roles times applications, users times roles, we start to get some volume there. So we're going to talk about maintaining that data as well. And so what we'll talk about first is maybe the audit side of things, and from a fraud detector perspective, one of the things that we want to walk through is in fraud detector, as we turn on the data itself and we start to track things like customer master, bank account master, vendor master, changes to those tables, those records right before and after every time someone makes changes. So even just in normal, appropriate daily activity, once we flag records to be tracked, all of those triggers are going to happen and bring up data. So we have put in place on the what would be the reporting tool there, a batch application that purges the audit tables out of your system and can reset that data in your system. And so if you actually open up the program, you can look at the actual processing tabs. Now there's a proof and final mode, just like any other JD Edwards table that runs programs against tables. You can check to see what's going to happen before you happens to do it. And then you can actually run this process across all the environments. You can actually hit one to purge any current and previously audited tables. And if you're only wanting to look at purging currently audited tables, you can do the ones that are current so that you don't delete the history. You can also keep a retention policy, right? 18 months, that kind of thing. Just know that we will not purge anything that has not been resolved. So even if it's 19, 20 months old and it's got an open issue on it on our side, we're not going to purge it until someone resolves that resolution and you run this process again. And then there's the M060 table. This is one of the additional detail tables that goes along with it. A lot of times we'll have people flag this to say, match what you're going to purge so that your system is sort of clean and from that environmental side. So fraud detector is part of its process in our system is designed to give you that level of detail, the before after value, the time date stamp, the user count, all of that stuff. So one of the things that we suggest is that you have a concept of what your auditor would want this retention policy to be. I used 18 months for the demonstration and the common conversation here, but sometimes that's really 72 months or 60 months. It's 5 years, 7 years, those kinds of things. So you'll need to make sure that if you have an internal auditor, that you communicate with them and ask them what your retention policy is going to be. Number two, if you have an external auditor, you certainly get clarification from that external auditor how that's going to work. And then also from the backside of things, you actually make sure that from your CNC side or your database administrator side, you can certainly choose to back these tables up, look at them from a design perspective, back the table up off site, off system, if you will, and leave them on a retention policy, sort of like you do when you have a replicated environment. So all of those strategies can work in this table, in this situation. And Audit Manager is a very powerful, or fraud detector is a very powerful tool. It takes some time to implement and some time to effort to get it to work, but when it has been configured and is running, it is very valuable for tracking real-time activity. So if you have that in play, that's sort of the suggestion, if you will, going forward with that. From a Security Manager Pro side, three things really actually kind of go into reviewing this piece, and that is looking at what your 950 and what you have in our work tables, how those map against each other. And the reason for that is, remember, we don't deal with actual data in the system, and we're not integrated into JD Edwards table structures so that you don't have to worry about us changing the way the system works. Our data is run and validated out of the system in work tables, and then we inject that record with a matching algorithm to change and update the records that are in the 950. What that can happen is, as you go through larger implementations with role, security, and architecture being changed based on additional processing, additional companies, things may be changing from compliance issues for you, more detailed analysis. All of those new things that come into the SMP work files then kind of put into a stale status the value of those that were there prior to it. So this report, the RY5AF 5950, will actually give you a comparison and show you the reporting of what's been changed and what's been done. And then the other part of that is, as you build the function and components in Security Manager Pro, you can use this report or the inquiry process to provide you with where have we built things up and come up with testing ideas, things that we might want to use as a process maybe, or a function container, and then we decide not to do it. So those things, that disconnection between functions and components, that will actually give you that listing of reports as well. And so if you run the actual comparison, it will actually look at you and say, here's where we have disconnected records in the system. There's a program ID, it's not assigned to anything, and you can actually take that and remove that from use in the system. That gives you some cleanup work to do, but it also keeps things nice and tight and tidy so that you're working with the relevant data, that you're not working with archived roles or functions and components, and kind of gives you that oversight and that view that everything that you're working with is more streamlined. One of the best parts about that is, for example, is that you can see if you have an unattached function and components on this report, you can actually go back and look at whether or not those functions are necessary in your system. So if no one's using them and you've built them, now you have a chance to decide, is that because we've missed it, or is that something that we can clean up and trim up our architecture side of things so that we don't have anything that's sort of invalid as far as what we would present. Now, if that comes along with the internal auditors or external auditors who want to see how your architecture is built, you're not using words that don't have any, that are sort of false positives, right? That, hey, we don't have security in place and no one uses it. And then from the actual program itself, you can actually type in a template ID, and on the screen, you can inquire on those components, and it will show you those that do not have functions or components attached to them. Obviously, our stuff is always built JD Edwards tool sets. This is exportable to Excel real time, and you can do the analysis and the drill downs right within the application itself. And then, so from user access review, from the periodic review side of things, this is where, depending on the number of users that you have and the number of roles that you have, you could get into some serious volume of data. A lot of the clients that I've worked with in the past have had 100, 300, 500 users, and on top of that, 30 or 40 roles and multiple roles per user. So then exponential growth in record count happens very, very quickly. And so what we do here is, in the periodic review access control, you can actually go through the system and purge those audit tables as you decide they're relevant to be purged. And the idea is you can come up with a policy of retention. So let's pretend, for argument's sake, that you are doing an audit once every every year, let's say. You can actually put in here and the number of years that you want to retain. We suggest 7 years as a sort of global audit perspective, but you can take 365, multiply it by 7, and stick around 5,000 days out here, and you'll keep those audits in place and in track. Again, having a backup policy behind it, something that gives you the raw table as a backup, as something that you can restore from, gives us the ability to go back to the database architecture team and say, hey, we want to pull this up in SQL or some other database utility and search through it if it's absolutely crucial. But 5 to 7 years tends to be the norm. And this audit data allows you to show, keeping it on system, quick access to get that data out in front of somebody if there's a question about how policy went and who was approving access to different aspects of the company. And that gives you also a smaller table, a static record count on the table, so that as the system indexes those records and pulls them up to view, you get faster response times, and it's more accurate from a view perspective. So just to kind of recap, and again, this is only going to take us about 25 minutes or so to talk to. So if you have questions, please feel free to jump on and ask some. It's always nice to talk to you as a group. One of the things you want to do is make sure that you look at all and any of the tables that you're going to work with before you make any changes. Look at the data, get a view at the backside of it, go to data browser, take a view of what's there, and understand sort of trending volume for all of your tables. Make sure that you can see the volume was high at the beginning and lower at the end, and that you kind of know what your averages are and how that's going to affect you, and give yourself a comfort zone of what the data looks like before you run any of the purges. 2, make sure that there's some sort of backup process. Do some testing, run it in a test environment, if you will, the audit, have your data refreshed to test, run these values in test, and make sure that you're comfortable with the results that are out there. Run some scenarios, build a use case up if something happened after I did this purging. What would I have access to try and track it down? What types of situations have you dealt with in the past, and can you still meet those requirements after you've done this sort of practice, if you will? I did mention best practices, 7 years of audit history if you get into that kind of thing, especially in a situation where you're running fraud detector and you've got transactional data. That volume can get really, really high really, really quickly. So you do want to make sure that you keep yourself in what your auditor suggests, but that you make sure that it's not too high. And that's sort of a daily, monthly thing. You might want to create a backup process that pulls that off your system with the archiving tool if you have one of those in play as well. And then always run in proof mode first. Always get a feeling for what that record's going to look like when you're done. Get that documentation, that PDF that tells you you're comfortable with how it looks ahead of time, and ensure that you haven't actually deleted any of the processing power that you need going forward. And from that perspective, then I think as we kind of come to the close on the subject, I'll ask Ian if anybody has any questions or situations where they've got any of this stuff that they need to talk about volume-wise or otherwise. And actually, there is the next webinar that we're going to do is 3 simple steps to integrate Oracle EBS with SAML 2.0, single sign-on. So that single sign-on thing's the new trend, right? That's what everybody is working on. I've worked with several companies that have got that down and working really well with single sign-on a number of different platforms. Certainly makes it easy not to have to remember 7 passwords. I'm getting old. I'm over the idea of having to write it down on Post-it notes. So let's hope that this helps everybody. That's Thursday, October 6th, 1 p.m. Central. If you'd like an invite to that, please reach out to us, and we will certainly give you that feedback if at all possible. We'll also get you a copy of the recording from today, as well as, or the PDF from today. Recording, I'm not sure about. And then we'll basically kind of be here to answer questions if you have any. Going forward, if you have any questions, you can certainly send your responses, your questions, your input, if you will, something you'd like to talk about in the future, to mike.ward@pathlock.com. And he's now running the sales for all of North America and Asia Pacific. So he'll be happy to help point you in the right direction, or as I will as well. You can certainly email me, preston.leftwich@pathlock.com. As far as I'm concerned, that is what I had for today. I know it's kind of neat and tidy. That's kind of the intention, right? Make everybody feel like we can get things done quickly and efficiently. If there aren't any questions, I will say thank you very much for your time, and we'll see you again sometime in the future, I hope. Take good care. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.